What was Ellis Island? By Patricia, Brennan, Demuth. Illustrated by David Groff. Read by Mr. Kane. What was Ellis Island? The Island of Hope. Many people thought of Ellis Island that way. Millions and millions of immigrants came to this tiny island off New York City from 1892 to 1954. Ellis Island was their first stop in America. It had to be. Until they passed through there, newcomers could not set foot inside the United States. But over the years, at least 250,000 immigrants failed the tests. Those unlucky ones were not allowed into the United States. Sent back on the ships, they returned to where they had come from. This earned Ellis Island its other name, the Island of Tears. The Statue of Liberty. For over 125 years, the Statue of Liberty has stood tall as a symbol of freedom in New York Harbor. The statue was a gift of friendship from the people of France to the people of the United States. In 1903, part of a poem by Emma Lazarus entitled "The New Colossus" was inscribed on the base. Its famous last lines are a ringing welcome from America to its immigrants. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. The wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. Chapter 1. A Scrap of Land. At first, Ellis Island was just a small scrap of empty land, a little over 3 acres. It barely stuck out of the water at high tide. The local Native Americans called it Gull Island. Seagulls were the only creatures that lived there. Around the time of the Revolutionary War, a farmer named Samuel Ellis bought the land. Although he later sold it, the island would keep his name. Then, in 1808, the U.S. government became the island's new owner. For a long while, the island was only used for storing guns to protect the harbor. No one dreamed that one day Ellis Island would become the gateway to America for many waves of immigrants. In fact, for most of the 1800s, the U.S. government did not control immigration. There was an open door policy. That meant that any immigrant who wanted to could move there. The states were in charge of keeping track of the newcomers. The flow of immigrants remained fairly slow until the mid-1800s. Then, a huge wave of people started to pour into the country. 9 out of 10 came from Ireland, England, or Germany. The state of New York alone admitted 8 million immigrants from 1855 to 1890. They came through a station called Castle Garden at the tip of New York City. Finally, in 1890, the federal government took over immigration from the individual states. It wanted to start testing newcomers to make sure they were free of disease and able to support themselves. Where would it build the first immigration station? Ellis Island seemed the perfect place. It was located in New York Harbor, where so many ships from Europe already docked. Yet the island was too tiny for the job. No problem. The island was made bigger. Engineers built a seawall away from the island. It was set deep into the harbor floor. They filled the area in between the wall and the island with tons of landfill, dirt, sand, and stone. At the time, vast tunnels, miles long, were being dug in New York City for a subway system. A lot of the landfill for Ellis Island came from the dirt shoveled out to make way for the subways. Ellis Island greeted its first immigrants on New Year's Day, 1892. An Irish girl named Annie Moore was the first to step foot on the island. Just 15 years old, she had brought her two younger brothers, to America. Their parents were already there, so the three children made the long voyage by themselves. Today, a statue of brave Annie stands on the island. Then, only 5 years after opening, the buildings on Ellis Island were burned to the ground. Plans for rebuilding started immediately. The old buildings had been made of wood. The new ones were made of red brick and stone. Now, Ellis Island was completely fireproof. Right from the start, Ellis Island was swamped with more people than it could handle. During its first year, Ellis Island admitted nearly 450,000 immigrants, and the numbers kept growing. In 1898, a second island, also made of landfill, was added. Still, Ellis Island was too small to handle the crush of people. So, in 1906, a third and final island was added. Annie Moore, 1877 to 1924. Annie Moore had a special 15th birthday on January 1st, 1892. She was the first immigrant to land at Ellis Island. Officials handed the rosy-cheeked Irish girl a $10 gold piece for the honor. Leaving County Cork in Ireland 12 days earlier, Annie had traveled in steerage on the steamship Nevada. She brought her two younger brothers, Anthony, 11, and Philip, 7, with her. Despite her happy arrival, Annie faced the hard life of many immigrants. She settled with her parents in the Lower East Side of New York City and never moved more than a few blocks away. Marrying a bakery clerk, Annie gave birth to 11 children, though 5 died as infants. Annie died in 1924 at age 47. Now complete, Ellis Island was really 3 islands in one. From 3.3 acres, it had grown to 27.5 acres. The island was like a separate city in the harbor. There were 33 buildings, including a hospital, laundry, and power plant to make electricity. There were places to exchange foreign money, buy railroad tickets, and send telegrams. But the biggest and most important building by far was the main building. A massive structure. It was where all immigrants went when they first stepped on dry land, and where they found out if the United States would become their new home, or if they would be sent back to their native land. Early Irish immigrants. Between 1845 and 1855, more than 1 million Irish immigrants arrived in America. Back in Ireland, blight was ruining the potato crops. Without their staple food, 1 million Irish starved to death. The terrible time became known as the Potato Famine. By 1855, Ireland had lost 1/4 of its population to death or emigration. In the United States, the Irish still faced hard times. Prejudice against their Catholic religion was widespread in a country that was mostly Protestant. Shops and factories posted signs that said, "No Irish need apply." Irish workers survived by shoveling coal, unloading ships, and cleaning yards. The huge wave of incoming Irish transformed the populations of New York City and Boston. In 1847, when the first Irish masses arrived, New York City had a total population of 372,000. Nearly double that number of Irish, about 650,000, flooded into the city during the next 10 years. Chapter 2. Leaving Home. A major shift in U.S. immigration happened at the end of the 1800s. Until then, most immigrants had come from Northern and Western Europe. But at the end of the century, immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe flooded into America. Most came from Italy, Greece, Russia, Hungary, and Poland. What made so many people leave their homeland? America was growing fast. Some people came for jobs in all the new factories in big cities. Some came to get cheap land out west. But terrible hardship drove most immigrants across the ocean to America. Millions were so poor, families didn't have enough to eat or any way to earn a living. Some governments oppressed their people. In Italy, there was famine as well as natural disasters. Earthquakes, tidal waves, and the eruption of Mount Etna. "I do not want to raise my children in Italy any longer," one mother told her son. "I don't want no famine. I don't want no poverty. If we go to America, at least we'll eat." Many immigrants suffered because of their religion. In Russia, hundreds of Jews were beaten and killed in attacks called pogroms. Thousands of Jews were left homeless when their houses were set on fire and their villages destroyed. Mary Anton, a young Jewish girl who escaped to America in 1894, later wrote about the terror back in Russia. "Mobs attacked Jewish families with knives and clubs and scythes and axes," she said. "People who saw such things never smiled anymore, and sometimes their hair turned white in a day." Scraping up enough money for the fare to America was not easy. Often a family had to move in stages. The father usually went first. He worked in the United States and saved until he had enough money to send for his family. When the time to go finally came, few could believe it. Many had never been away from their villages before. Now they were crossing an ocean 3,000 miles wide. They were headed for a country where people spoke a different language, wore different clothes, and ate different food. Going to America then was almost like going to the moon, said immigrant Golda Meir, who later became Prime Minister of Israel. What should they bring from home to start a new life? Not very much. Immigrants could only bring what they could carry or wear. As a result, some wore all their clothes in layer upon layer. They had to leave behind their furniture and other possessions. In America, they would be starting all over. The travelers were leaving behind family and friends, often forever. One immigrant recalled, saying goodbye to his father in Italy. He said, "Make yourself courage," and that was the last I ever saw my father. Immigrants made their way to the steamships any way they could, even on foot. At the docks, they couldn't board until they were vaccinated, given shots against disease, and checked for lice. They also had to answer several questions. What is your name, age, and place of birth? What is your height and race? Have you ever been to prison? The steamship companies wrote down their answers in huge logs, called manifests. They screened immigrants with care. If anybody was sent back from Ellis Island, the steamship companies had to pay for the return trip. The Atlantic voyage took about 10 days. However, bad weather could make it twice as long. Immigrants usually could only afford a ticket in the rough area at the bottom of the ship, near the steering equipment. It was called steerage. You can see the steerage section of the ship right here. On the fancy upper decks of the ships, there were cabins, but in steerage, there were just rows of bunk beds. 1,000 or more men, women, and children were packed together. It was dark and damp below sea level, with no portholes to let in fresh air. Food was dished out of pails. To wash up, people had to use cold salt water from a faucet. Many immigrants lie in their bunks for most of the voyage, in a dulled state caused by the foul air, said a government report. So this is where all the fancy people with a lot of money sat and slept and traveled. Immigrants rejoiced when at last they entered New York Harbor. Edward Corsi was just 10 when he came to America in 1907. He later wrote, "Mother and father lifted up the babies so that they could see the Statue of Liberty. Next stop, Ellis Island."